An empty canvas. Looks clean, yet incomplete. Like us, it represents potential. But as it is filled, it represents a divine artistry. Starting from the first stroke, layering, blending, reshaping a surface that was once bare. It gives life to something that looked lifeless. It gives flavor to a bland slate. It provides colors of love and forgiveness. It provides textures of mercy and truth. And with the nature of our chaotic lives, some strokes or colors might look like they don't belong. But as you step back, you realize there is one artist that is in control. An artist that paints to flip the culture into something unexpected. A kingdom culture.
And so we get to start a brand new teaching series this morning called Kingdom Culture from Matthew chapter 5. I'm excited to be able to do this with you. We are looking at one of the most famous passages of Scripture. It's actually Jesus' most famous sermon or message, and it's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's here that we actually see Jesus give us a countercultural approach to life. It's the way of Jesus as he meets humanity, and it produces what we would call kingdom culture. Now, if you have ever really looked at the values and ways of culture without Jesus and felt like it was empty, lacking real, true substance, this series could be for you. If you ever felt yourself wanting more out of this life than simply whatever you can get yourself out of this life, this series could be for you. And if you have felt like power and fame and money never really satisfy, I want to encourage you that you will find hope in the message for today and in this teaching series from Matthew 5. And so I want you to, if you have a Bible, please turn to Matthew chapter 5. You can pull out your smartphone as well. Matthew's the first book in the New Testament. So there's like 66 books in the Bible. 39 are the Old Testament, 27 are the New. And first in your order is the book of Matthew. And so this is Matthew. It's one of the four Gospels. We're going to see that the Gospels tell us about Jesus' life and his teachings. And so we're going to get a significant portion of Jesus' teaching over the course of the next few weeks. And Jesus' teaching is a pretty good teaching to get. And so I hope you'll be able to lean in on that as well. Matthew chapter 5. If you have any background in the Bible, you might have heard these verses before. They are called the Beatitudes. And so you'll notice that in these verses, they start out with the word blessed. And so we're going to have a conversation about the kingdom culture, the way of Jesus, how Jesus says we could live that would be the best way for us. And that comes out of Matthew chapter 5. And so we're going to be looking this morning at the first 5 verses. But I think it's good for us to actually read all of the verses that we'll be covering this week, and then the verses that we'll be covering next week. And so you can follow along with me as I read, starting in Matthew chapter 5. The verses will be on the screen behind me as well, in case you don't have a Bible with you. Here's what the text says. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. These verses they're tightly packed, but there's a lot in them. But what they do is they really teach us what we would call, or what we are calling in this series, kingdom culture. And I think it's important to see that as you listen to these words, as you kind of let them just kind of seep into your souls, that maybe you're thinking that these are like radical words. And I would say that they are indeed radical words. Like that would have been the way they would have hit in that day. And so if you're feeling today, as you listen to these words, you're like, man, that's a totally different way of looking at life. It's a totally different way of looking at the way that we could thrive in this world. Yes, that's the case. It is meant to be radical words. It's a radical way of living. But it's not radical just because it's radically different. Like we could live radically different today, but that not actually be what we would call kingdom culture. The reason that it's radically different is because it's godly. The reason it's radically different is because it is the way of Jesus. In fact, let me say it this way. Kingdom culture is radical living that follows King Jesus. That's really what it is. Kingdom culture is radical living that follows King Jesus. In other words, being radically different doesn't automatically make us people living in a kingdom culture. We have kingdom culture because we are following and pursuing the King, and following and pursuing the King will lead to a radically different way of living than we lived prior to Jesus. And so I want to kind of pursue that over the course of the next couple of weeks. I want to start out this morning by looking at verses 1 and 2 because we see something very specific here about kingdom culture, which is this. Jesus was intentional about creating kingdom culture. Jesus was intentional about creating kingdom culture. In other words, this did not happen by accident. Like Jesus was intentional about cultivating a completely new way of living. We see that here in verses 1 and 2. Notice what the text says. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. And there his disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And so Jesus could observe clearly two groups of people that were listening to his teaching. What you have in the text is you have his inner circle of disciples. These are people that would identify themselves as followers of Jesus. They were committed to following Jesus, living the way that Jesus wanted them to live. Imperfectly, for sure, but they were committed to that. And then you had this greater group of people called the crowd. And Jesus was intentional in drawing both groups to this message. And so on the one hand, we see he is calling his disciples toward this radical way of living based on the relationship with him. But then he's also, at the same time, he has this other group of people, this crowd, this group of people who weren't necessarily followers of him. And he's painting a picture of a distinctly different way of living for people who did not yet have that relationship with him. And so what made Jesus so unique as he was teaching, as he was on this earth, is that both his followers and people who were curious but not yet his followers wanted to hear him. Jesus as a person was unique in that way. But his message was also that way. Because this crowd, they wanted to know what this other radical way of living was all about. And I will just say parenthetically that just as that was true back then, I think it's true today. Now, I think there's a group of people in Hebron and in our surrounding communities who wouldn't consider themselves followers of Jesus, but are thirsty for something different than what they are being fed and drinking in culture. And you have personal contacts with those people. You have personal connections. In fact, maybe some of you in the room this morning, you are at that place. You're like, you would say, I would identify with that crowd. I'm interested in understanding what makes Jesus unique and what makes the message of Jesus unique, what makes Christianity unique. And so Jesus is throwing out this kingdom culture to the crowd that identified that way, as well as to his disciples. So let's look at the first three pieces of this kingdom culture, verses 3, 4, and 5. Here's what these three verses say. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Now, I'm not sure what your understanding of poor in spirit is. I'm pretty sure you have an idea of what mourning is. And I'm not sure that your understanding of the word meek. But I'm going to guess that these three words are not the most popular words that culture would say is the pathway to happiness, the pathway to fulfillment, the pathway to joy, the pathway to meaning, the pathway to purpose, the pathway to the best for your life. And yet, this is what Jesus calls out as the best way forward for us. And this causes me to think that kingdom culture is likely the opposite of conventional thinking. That as we hear these words, we're like, this has gotta, I don't think this is the way. We're talking ourselves into I don't think so. And yet Jesus goes all in on these words. Now remember that he's talking to two groups of people. When he talks to his disciples here, these are people who are committed to following him. We get a sense in which Jesus is trying to tell them, hey, this is a radically different way of living, but it's based on this great transformation that is happening in their lives. It's the same great transformation that has happened in our lives. In other words, kingdom culture comes as a direct result of what Jesus has done for us. We don't actually live radically different lives unless we are actually transformed by Jesus. But here's the thing. If you put your faith and trust in Jesus, you have been radically transformed by him. And I get that that's a process, and that's a lifelong process. But the things that we're going to see here in the text this morning, God, through the Holy Spirit, is working in your life and in mine to bring about, and it's the best way forward for us. And so all because of what Jesus did in dying on the cross and rising from the dead, we can experience kingdom culture in our lives. And kingdom culture is radical living that follows King Jesus. And I want to just say parenthetically that it's radical because we don't simply do what we want or what we think, but we're actually following Jesus. So let's get into verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So we see here, first of all, the first piece of this radical kingdom culture is that the poor in spirit are blessed. Now, what does it mean to be poor in spirit? John Piper captures well, I think, this meaning. He says this: it is a sense of powerlessness in ourselves. It is a sense of spiritual bankruptcy and helplessness before God. It's a sense of moral uncleanness before God. It is a sense of personal unworthiness before God. It is a sense that if there is to be any life or joy or usefulness, it will have to be all of God and all of grace. Now, I get maybe if you're here this morning and you're exploring who Jesus is and you hear that and you're like, man, that's like, those are really direct words. And that could be tough to take in, but remember, the truth is always helpful to our soul, even if it is direct. Piper continues on. He says, the reason I say it is a sense of powerlessness and sense of bankruptcy and sense of uncleanness and sense of unworthiness is that objectively speaking, everybody is poor in spirit. Everybody, whether they sense it or not, is powerless without God and bankrupt and helpless and unclean and unworthy before God. But not everybody is blessed. the ironic thing is that the people who are blessed, the people who experience joy and happiness in their lives are the people that come to the realization that we have nothing without God. Because that's where we are then able to be transformed most fully. You see, our modern culture says, you are all you have and you are all you need. But kingdom culture says God is all you have and God is all you need. And the sense of this truth is what it means to be poor in spirit. It's basically to be spiritually self-aware. You've met people, right, that are not the most self-aware people in the world? You know what I'm talking about? Right? And so you meet them. It's funny, like people are looking at each other like they know somebody. Hopefully it's not each other, but like you get the idea, right? But that there's people that are like, you should probably know yourself better than you do. And we look at that and we wish that they would know themselves better, but this is kind of this spiritually self-aware that as we become really aware of who we are without Jesus, we are in one of the best places in the world, because then it's where we embrace Jesus, we put our faith and trust in Jesus, we are then transformed by Jesus. And so being poor in spirit is a good place for us to be. The text says that the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. This is a way I think of Jesus telling us that those who understand our spiritual poverty are the ones that Jesus calls citizens of heaven. Now, there's a second piece that we see in verse 4, and I want to take you there. Here's what verse 4 says. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. What does those who mourn mean? Like, does this mean that if we just constantly weep, that we are going to be blessed by God? Right? Is that just simply what it means? There's a little bit more nuance to it than that. The idea of those who mourn is those who mourn over their sin. People who mourn are people who are aware of the fact that they fall short of what God requires. They see their sinfulness, and they don't blame others. They don't blame God, but instead they own their sin. Now, I'm going to argue that our modern culture loves to blame other people and situations for the sin that we commit. It is in every area of life. If you are employed by a company and you worked this past week and something went wrong, there's a pretty good chance that somebody tried to blame somebody else, or situations or circumstances or something along that lines. If you are in a family environment, right? If you have a brother or sister, or you had a brother or sister growing up, your knee-jerk reaction was whenever something that was your problem, there was a pretty good chance you blamed it on your sister or your brother. And it's the same thing in every area of life. Politics, community, whatever it is, the first response is to blame somebody else. Blame God. Blame situations. We are blame shifters. And I would argue this is even true within a subset of our Christian culture. Like that even within our Christian culture at times, we refuse to own our own sin. I mean, I've sat with marriage counseling enough to know that there is a statement made by somebody, one spouse going, I know I did this, but, and like, I did this because that person did that, right? So like, this is a thing. And I find myself blaming Colleen sometimes, right? It can't possibly be my fault, right? So we have this thing, right? Even within the subject. Look, Colleen's a wonderful person. You know that by now. So I'm not blaming her for anything. We have a good marriage. I didn't mean it like that. Sometimes it's better to put the shovel down. So I'm going to do that. We like to blame people. It goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? When Adam and Eve created sinless, and what happens? They eat of the fruit and they blame each other. They blame Satan, the serpent. They blame everybody else. And it's been happening from Adam and Eve all the way forward. Those who mourn are people who know their sinfulness and don't blame others, don't blame situations, don't blame circumstances, but own that. And one of the reasons why Christians could be really good at this, we can actually be really good at owning our own sin, is because as followers of Jesus, Jesus has paid for our sins, past, present, and future. And we recognize that because Jesus has paid for our sin debt has been paid. That sin no longer reigns in our lives. So like that, we don't actually have to sin. Without Jesus, we're kind of in bondage to sin. We don't always sin, but we're kind of in bondage. We can't eventually not help but not to sin. But with Jesus in our lives, he's broken that bondage so that we don't actually have to sin. And that when God looks at us, he sees the perfect record of Jesus, even though we still sin. And so the text says that blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. You may be saying, well, how could they be comforted? They can be comforted exactly because of the good news of Jesus. Exactly because we have the real joy of forgiveness. That you walk out of here today, and even if you have screwed up royally this week, you put your faith and trust in Jesus, God still sees Jesus' perfection, not your sinfulness. That's how you can be comforted. And if you're not yet a follower of Jesus, you're still stuck in this mentality of going, am I doing enough to earn forgiveness? And of course, the Bible would say, I don't say this kindly, the Bible would say this, that one sin means you can't do enough. What you need in this moment is Jesus and Jesus alone. And so we can be comforted by the gospel, that Jesus provides forgiveness. We can be honest about the fact that we are sinners and that we sin, because we have Jesus who has bridged the gap between us and God. And that because of Jesus, we have real hope and we have real forgiveness. And so the way forward is a simple one, and that we just own our sin because Jesus has it taken care of. Now, the third and final piece that we're going to look at this morning from the text is in Matthew chapter 5, verse 5. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Who are the meek? And what does it mean to be meek? Or what does meekness mean? Sinclair Ferguson describes meekness this way. It is the humble strength that belongs to the man or woman who has learned to submit to difficulties, difficult experiences, difficult people, knowing that in everything God is working for his good. The meek man or woman is the one who has stood before God's judgment and abdicated, which is to say, surrendered all his supposed rights. He has learned in gratitude for God's grace to submit himself to the Lord and to be gentle with sinners. Someone else has described meekness this way. A meek person is not a weak person, but a person who is strong in Jesus. Our culture, our modern culture, believes that we need to will our way to get what we want. Push hard to get what we want. But willing our way to get what we want is not the way of kingdom culture. It is not the best way for us or for those around us. And Jesus knows that. He understands, in fact, that as we submit to God, what happens in our lives is that God opens doors in our lives. And God leads us down paths in our lives that are for our good and for his glory, and that he alone knows best. And so we find that in our submission, we find satisfaction and meaning and purpose. There are a group of people in our world today who have experienced the pinnacle of whatever they thought the world had for them, the best. Sometimes it shows up in power. Sometimes it shows up in fame. Sometimes it shows up in money, prestige, accomplishment. They can find it in academics, in their job, in their community. And when they get to the peak, when they get to the pinnacle, and they get to that top place and look around and realize, what do I do now? What's next? The thing that I thought was going to bring me satisfaction, the thing that I thought was going to bring me meaning, the thing that I thought was going to bring me purpose, It didn't bring what I thought it would bring. And you can talk to many people who are not followers of Jesus who would tell you that. And why do they tell you that? It's because what culture offers isn't the best. What Jesus offers is the only place where we will find lasting meaning, lasting satisfaction, and lasting purpose. And we see that coming through in these verses that describe to us this kingdom culture. In the text it says, blessed are those who mourn, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. What does it mean to inherit the earth? Now there's a couple different ideas here, but I think the one that makes the most sense is there seems to be a reference to the future. That we who are meek will in the future rule and reign with Jesus. That those of us who are meek will see a new heaven and a new earth far greater than the current one. You see, all the way back in the beginning, in Genesis chapter 1, I referenced this earlier with Adam and Eve, God created the world, and it was perfect and sinless. But then sin entered the world. And so that man became depraved. It was corrupt. We were corrupt, but the earth as well began to decay. It's corrupt. It was flawed, all because of sin. But one day in the future, we will see a new heaven and a new earth that looks very much like that original, without sin, that will be restored. And those who inherit this will be those who put their faith and trust in Jesus and are seeing this kingdom culture lived out in their lives. The meek in particular in the text. Okay, so what do we get? What do we take from this passage to apply to our lives right here, right now, this week? And I want to give you two things I think that will be helpful for us in this process. Number one, we need to challenge our current understanding of what is the best way forward for us. Because you can be here this morning and you can be listening to everything that Jesus has said and you're saying, that's not the best way forward. This can't be the best way forward. There's a better way forward that our culture has taught us or that I've learned in other places. But the reality is what Jesus is teaching here is the best way forward for us. The people who are going to be blessed will be the exact opposite of what we think, according to Jesus. So my suggestion to you this morning, as you listen both this week and next and hear this kingdom culture described, let Jesus' words seep deep into your souls and challenge your current way of thinking if it doesn't line up with what Jesus is teaching here. Number two, we need to find Jesus to find the best way forward. Without Jesus, we cannot be poor in spirit. We cannot mourn. We cannot be meek. The biggest step forward for some of us here this morning who may be curious about who Jesus is but are not yet followers of him is that you need to find Jesus. You need to personally put your faith and trust in what Jesus has done in your lives. You need to let him lead your life, not you. You need to understand that Jesus came to this earth, lived a sinless life, died on the cross, rose from the dead, all for you to pay your past sins, your present sins, your future sins, and that when you put your faith and trust in him, he completely forgives you permanently of your sin. And he transforms your life. And you will start to see this kingdom culture popping up in your life. We can't get to where we want to be on our own. Only Jesus can get us there. We need him. It's part of the reason why people who did not believe in Jesus as a Savior continued to follow Jesus while he was on this earth. It is a groundswell of people. It was amazing. People who did believe, but people who didn't believe. But the people who didn't believe were curious because Jesus had something that they did not have. And they knew that. And that is still true today. We need him. And the great thing about Jesus is that he is always willing to come into our lives to forgive us and to lead us into this great kingdom culture.